Okay, so this elective is going to introduce you to some of the kind of core disputes in environmental and ecological economics. I think I tagged this elective or described it as it has some significant role to play in debates about kind of the cost of regulations, the economy DAs, industry-oriented stuff. I think it's also has a pretty significant role to play in any debates that you might have about growth, DDEV, um, and various Ks of kind of understanding what is a resource or whether or not something is a resource. So I'll kind of approach it from that perspective. I want to, highlight that we're going to be talking about material that's mostly theoretical, as in like it is connected to kind of theoretical disputes about what our economy is and how we should understand it, how we should depict it. I'm going to give you, I've tried to gather a few kind of graphics for this one to help explain some of the different modeling assumptions or theoretical assumptions that are found in these different approaches to economics. So, please raise a hand or I will be monitoring the chat. Something just jumping way too fast or didn't follow a point, go ahead and put something in there. I'll try and adjust. But with that, I want to start with a recognition that this topic raises a lot of questions about how it is that we should balance or under balance already brings in a certain theoretical assumption. I was going to say balance economic versus environmental concerns. And in some ways, the elective here focuses on whether or not those things really can be balanced. Are they the same thing? Like, what is the relationship between an economy and the environment or ecology? And I'm going to start with, I borrowed a lot of the graphics from a book that I would highly recommend by Kate Rayworth, who wrote Donut Economics. It's a really excellent source for kind of thinking through some of these larger debates about environmental economics. There are a number of journals that are also kind of prominent in this field. Ecological economics, foremost among them. If that's, if you wanted to do some follow-up reading and really get involved in where this stuff shows up, that's one of the places that I would start. But let's begin with, I'm going to share my screen for some of these visuals. I want to start with the diagram provided. You'll see this is cited as, so this is Paul Samuelson's diagram from 1948. Samuelson's a Nobel Prize winning economist, largely responsible for translating a number of insights from Keynes into what people think of as some of the core kind of macroeconomic models that we use. And this image gives you the basis. Is it sufficiently large for people to see in detail everything that's going on? Can you give me a thumbs up if this is sized correctly? Like, can you see the whole diagram? Okay. So this is a diagram of circular flow, like basically a diagram of the entirety of economic activity in a particular national context. Okay. So like you might, when you probably understand that when our society does economic reporting, like reports on the rate of growth, right, that what we're doing is taking a bunch of survey data and putting it into a set of models that help explain how our economy is behaving and what set of things to expect out of that economic behavior and the direction of our economic activity. This circular flow diagram is, you might think of as a kind of fundamental picture. We'll go to a slightly more complex one in a minute here, but of what economic activity is defined in most conventional macroeconomic models. Okay, so you have here, people may understand that this is a pump, okay, right? That's why this little, like, this is the pump action over here. So technology, change in circumstances, that there are factors that are outside the circulation of economic activity that nevertheless affect the kind of, the rates of change that you will find in the inputs into the economy here, investment, right? So this is the pump. You've probably also heard the expression priming the pump. That's a slightly different part of this diagram, but the pump into economic activity via investment, okay? These values are, wages, interest, etc., accrue for the public. The public saves some of that money here, and then the rest of the money goes into consumption, right? So, you buy a meal at a restaurant, you buy a theater ticket, um, you like like your Spotify subscription, Netflix, whatever, right? All of that is consumption here. The consumption accrues to the businesses that provide those services, and businesses via mechanisms that are related to investment, right? They pay out wages, they accrue interest in their investments, they accrue growth in the sense that some of those profits are turned back into capital that makes the business more profitable. And that's the circular flow diagram. So it's like, this is what macroeconomic activity looks like. When you're thinking about your, kind of any growth-based impact argument, right? That is about the circulation and growth in this diagram. If you look at a slightly more complex version of this, okay, here you see that we've added a few elements to our circular flow diagram, but it remains relatively similar. So here's the circulation of, right, households provide labor and human capital to business. Business provides goods and services to those same households, okay? Households spend into business, that is consumer spending, right, is part of demand for the goods and services provided by businesses. Businesses pay out wages and profits, either in the form of, stocked dividends or the growth of portfolio, or via wages, right? For workers, the vast majority of people are receiving most of their wealth via wage, rather than kind of profits that are distributed via stocks or bonds. But that's the circular flow between households and businesses, right? Leakages out of this include savings that people put into a bank account, taxes that the government takes out of household wealth or income, imports, right? That is when bringing something into a national economy, that counts as leakage out of the national economy, because you got to pay for those goods to come into the national economy. And then injections over here, banks make loans that invest in particular businesses with the prospect of future growth, right? The government spends money that is then distributed throughout the economy. So for example, like when the government signs a contract with Boeing for a bunch of military planes, like that's government spending that goes back into business. When you think about the infrastructure scenario for our politics agenda DA, right, that's government spending that is creating an injection in the economy. That's part of the reason that there are some growth related impacts to the infrastructure bill, right? And then trade exports, right, those are injections into national wealth, or the flow of national wealth. Okay. Does this diagram make some sense to people? Like, are these terms familiar enough that when you look at this model kind of as a circle, right? Here's national wealth. This is what it looks like to have our economy structured in most of these conventional models. Is that because we've got to kind of have a basis and understanding here to understand what the disputes are between this model and some of the environmental or ecological economists who think that there are some serious flaws to the way that we understand and depict our economy. So are we on solid enough ground to proceed to some of those objections? One kind of quick question that I have for everybody, you can put it in the chat, or unmute for a second if you want. How is everything in this diagram, like, what's the common what is the common denominator, or the kind of the common unit that you could use to represent everything that's on this diagram? How would you measure it? Like, if you were measuring any of the pieces of the diagram, what would you measure it in? This is ultimately a fairly simple answer, but one that is pretty important for what we're talking about next. Oh yeah, I forget that the chat is, yeah, money. Okay, both Dylan and Michael, you got it right there, right? Everything here could be given a monetary value, right? Just think about the ways that these things are labeled: labor and capital, wages and profits, spending, savings, investment, right? All of these are potentially, described as in terms of monetary value, right? The overall size of the economy, that's something that we could also describe in monetary value, right? Gross national product or gross domestic product. The core element of some of the environmental and ecological objections to this understanding of how an economy works is that all of the things found in that diagram being valued in monetary terms means that we have a tendency to mistake much of what's going on in our economic activity as though money provides the ultimate kind of common translation for all values. And in particular, the process of our economy. So there's you could read a guy named Thomas Princeton, who's another economist, kind of discusses the notion of a mining economy. He refers to all, so like, for instance, okay, the offshore drilling affirmative, right? It's very easy to understand extracting oil as extraction. Like, there's a bunch of oil down in the ground, deep underwater. You pull it out via the oil rig, right? You refine it, you turn it into a bunch of different fossil fuel kind of derived products, gasoline, kerosene, etc. Those get used up in our economy to drive us around, to power houses, power homes, right? That notion of extraction, okay, the environmental and ecological economists that we're going to be discussing, this is another diagram from Rayworth, that she describes this as the caterpillar model of economic design, okay? That is that you extract, so that this is when people talk about extractivism or the notion of resource extraction, that's the kind of the explanation of what you are taking from the larger environment is a set of energy and materials, okay? You make it into something else, someone uses that. So like, I use the gasoline to drive the car, right? Or I use like, we take the trees to turn them into paper to make them into the books that I like to read, so that I use them by keeping them on my bookshelf and reading them at different times. And eventually they degrade, like somebody throws them away, I loan them to someone else who gets rid of them. And what you get here is waste heat and waste matter, okay? And what what is the foremost element to notice in this depiction of an extractive economy? What is the diagram attempting to explain to us, most importantly, about how we think about what we are doing when you produce and make things for economic activity? Yeah, Dylan is right. There's no cycle. The arrows go in one direction, right? This is, you take and you lose, and that's the kind of foundational model of design, right? The hope in a lot of these, what is the, actually, before I go to the next diagram, somebody explain to me what the hope is in, like, if most of what we are doing is producing things that then are lost, right? So we take material and energy from the larger world around us, we turn it into other things that we use, and in that process, via entropy, we lose heat. We also waste a bunch of the matter. We turn it into stuff that is going to end up in a landfill. So somebody explain to me, if this set of arrows only goes one way, how could we end up with something that looks like a circle like this, that circulates this set of goods and services? So how is it that in our conventional economic understanding, even though we are using things, we ought to think of it as something like this cycle, where the use generates additional value? Or okay, Devin says caterpillar thinks about environmental resources, the cycle is about money. So in one of these understandings, right, we're about to get to kind of a core disagreement in between most conventional economic theories and environmental and ecological economics, okay? And that is a debate about substitutability, okay? Substitutability. That is, in conventional economic modeling or conventional economic theory, there is a presumption that most resources are substitutable for one another, okay? Another way to phrase this is that natural capital, so, what is in the environment, and human capital, that is things that are produced by humans, are substitutable. We should treat them as the same for the purposes of understanding what their role in the economy or their role in producing value is. And that's why we can say that both of them could be explained in monetary terms. Like, this amount of wood or this amount of oil is worth this much, because it's about what people are willing to pay for that set of resources. Okay. The cycle being about money, what is the kind of way, in this model, why is it that we should have confidence that the cycle can continue? Like, why is it that those things should be treated as substitutable? Does anybody know? Like, what is the basis for thinking about those things as substitutable? There are a couple different possible answers.
They could have like the same uses, I think.
Okay, so it might be that, it turns out that some of the things that we can use, we can find other things that are very similar that we can, pop right in there, and it's like keep using something with a slightly different input. Okay, so like substitutability might be about, there is a large set of resources that are largely similar. Okay, what happens when, some of those things can't be substituted for one another? So like, let's take the example of like whale oil. Okay, anybody have any of you had to read Moby Dick? No. Okay, we used to kill a lot of whales to manufacture a lot of whale oil to use in oil lamps. We don't do that anymore. What happened?
I think human capital is substitutable with resources because they can like find new technologies or ways to get something that replaces it. Like in the context of whales, they found new ways to get oil that's not whales.
Okay, right. So part of substitutability might be an assumption that technological change can create different patterns of resource inputs, right? And that's why back in this diagram, tech change, etc., is right up here, right? That is that there are factors that will change the way that our economy works. Okay, so we've got technological change. There's an abundance of resources that are relatively similar. I think we're kind of missing one major category of part of the explanation for why we should have confidence that growth can continue. But you're doing a good job.
I'm not completely sure, but maybe labor.
Well, by that, do you mean, so for example, you could discuss that as productivity, that is that people will make more with less? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah.
Okay. Another way to think about that is efficiency, right? That we will use less but continue to produce as much or more, right? That could be connected to technological change as well, that it might be possible to produce more efficient uses of particular resources, right? So for example, like if you think about some of the efficiency of things like our appliances, okay, like the amount of power required to run the same size refrigerator that I have right now versus one that I could have been running in 1965, right? The energy efficiency of that refrigerator is going to be a good bit higher, right? Or like miles per gallon in your car, right? Like your parents at some point probably drove cars that had miles per gallon rating of like maybe 15 miles per gallon, right? And you could be driving a Prius or a hybrid that has an in-town miles per gallon rating of like somewhere between 45 and 50 miles per hour, right? Or miles per gallon. So there are efficiencies that you can gain either through technological innovation or other changes in inputs. So, in that, we have here kind of the like technological change, right? Efficiency and similarity of resources, or the ability to to slightly change the input but to maintain roughly the same process. Okay, in these are a number of the things that are found in an assumption of basically complete substitutability, that in no way will we run out of resources meaningfully, because we will find substitutes for those resources. We will find a way. Okay, and does anybody know how it is that in this model, how would we get an understanding that we need to change, right? So like, how do we know, like, if we're going to kill off all of the whales, which we almost did, okay? How would we know that in this model? How would we get some sense that it's like, oh, we need to change the set of resource inputs that we have?
Decreasing supply naturally increases prices. So it just naturally, because of the profit incentive, pushes people to find new technologies.
Okay, so the relationship between supply and demand, as modeled in a market-based economy, right? As supply decreases, and if demand remains the same, right? A couple things can happen there. Either demand changes, so there is, decreased demand for that particular resource. So that might be a situation where demand is relatively elastic, kind of like rubber band, like it has a very wide range. If demand for something is inelastic, it has a very small range. Okay, so but we could have changes in either demand or supply, right? So it could be the case that as supply shrinks, it's like the price will go up, the kind of amount that the person who owns the resource can ask for that resource goes up, and the price signal in our economy filters to, in theory, right? Like, one of the reasons that you might try and find an invention or a technology that can replace a particular resource input or make the use of that resource far more efficient is if you are getting a series of price signals, that means that there is a lot to be gained by finding a replacement, finding efficiencies, right? The price signal is the way that that stuff is communicated. Does that make sense to everybody? The efficiency arguments, okay, you may see this will come up in any of the material about growth, DDEV, etc., the notion of decoupling, okay? That is, how thoroughly can we decouple, that is unlink, right? So like if they're coupled together, decoupling is just pulling them apart. The amount of resource use from the level of growth, okay? These are a couple different pathways modeled by Rayworth that are examples of arguments about decoupling, okay? With the assumption of complete substitutability, we don't need to worry very much about which resources are being used for what, right? That's the whole point of substitutability. In that situation, so like if you see these different outcomes, relative decoupling, absolute decoupling, and sufficient absolute decoupling, okay, we'll talk about for a second, we'll get in a second to some of these terms, but the decoupling argument is, what if we can continue to increase growth while decreasing the kind of set of resources that are required to produce that growth? That is, the amount that we use begins to shrink at the same time as we continue to increase economic activity. And Rayworth's point here about relative absolute and sufficient absolute decoupling is that most of the ways that we think about efficiencies remain in this part of the graph. That is, they're about relative decoupling. You get more out of the same amount, okay? As in, it is relative to the prior usage. Like, you're not using as much as you did before, okay? But it's not absolute. You're not using less. You're just using less to get the same amount, right? That's what relative means there. It is relative to the amounts that you were using and getting before, right? Absolute decoupling would be, we are decreasing the total amount that is being used, right? So like in this diagram, we are decreasing the total take, okay? at the same time, and this is, you know, if you were to achieve absolute decoupling, at the same time that there is growth. That is, the amount that you take is no longer strongly connected to the amount that you're making. Okay. Sufficient absolute decoupling, we'll discuss this planetary boundaries issue, because this is this is where you know, a number of the ecological and environmental economists are going to disagree about some of the core assumptions that we'll get to in a second, because in most most of this economic theorists who strongly disagree with these models, the core initial point of disagreement that they have is the assumption of substitutability. In environmental economics, okay, substitutability is perceived as possible but difficult. Okay, possible but difficult for the most part. In ecological economics, okay, and some of these terms are a little fuzzy, but like there are environmental economists and there are ecological economists. There are some who would argue about exactly how we should make that distinction and whether or not the distinction is that strong. But bear with me for a moment that most ecological economists believe that substitutability for a very large set of natural resources or processes should never be assumed. That is, there is almost no substitute. We should assume very little substitutability for most resources. And resources there also refers to processes, which we'll get to in a second, because it's like, it's not just the stuff, it's the stuff that is required to maintain the stuff. It's, you know, thinking ecologically. So here's a very different diagram of what our economy looks like. Some people would refer to this as a model of an embedded economy. That is, where is the economy located, right? So here, if you go back to this diagram, right, we've already established that everything here, right, everything could be given a monetary valuation, right? And if you'll notice, like, I understand that, you know, it's just like, it's not the purpose of these diagrams, or maybe it is, right? They exist basically in a space that is totally disconnected from any wider sense of the world. That is, it's like what we are modeling is a set of circumscribed economic activity, okay? In this embedded economy model, do you see how it's like these different layers? It's like the economy is a subset of a number of other processes or activities. It isn't the whole scope of the diagram. It's actually a very small piece of the diagram that is embedded in these, like, you know, if you were to think of the Russian dolls or whatever, right? Like the economy is down there kind of in the middle of the Russian doll set instead of at the opening, okay? And the biggest shell here, right? Earth receives a great deal of solar energy. Solar energy is converted into living matter. And there are also pre-existing materials, right, that are like, then you're talking about solar or energetic processes that go way, way, way back, right, to, like, you know, the formation of the Earth, okay? But this energy and the materials that we draw from living matter or from the Earth's crust, they are inputs. Like, our society figures out ways to turn those into something else. They are organized by a variety of economic processes that the society decides to use. That is, there is a household, there's a state, there are common pool resources. Okay, so that is resources that are non-excludable, right? That you can't establish only one person can use them. So for anybody know a good example of the commons? Water, air, right? Nice, Devin. Like that, you can't, I can't, well, can't is a strong word, but just like, I can't sit around bottling air to, like, okay, well, now I'm gonna make air scarce and then distribute it, right? It is a common pool. It's not, I can't exclude you from the use of air, right? Or a market, right? That is, this is the place where you get those price signals. Like, I want something, so I bid or I have an ask, and someone determines whether or not they can satisfy that bid or that ask. Okay, and that there are financial flows between each of these portions of the way that the economy is organized. Okay. Out of this process, you get waste matter, right? Back on our earlier diagram, and waste heat. Heat also is a much larger loss, right? That it's like you absorb some solar energy, but the Earth radiates a lot of that heat energy as well, right? Do you see how this diagram, like in this model, what an economy is or what we are doing with economic activity is quite different? Like, for one, what very basic assumption that you all pointed out in that first diagram is no longer possible in this diagram? Or, sorry, I'm skipping a step. Might not be possible in this diagram. It would certainly be very difficult. What? Yeah, Dylan is right. Money as the unit, right? Like trying to give a monetary value to each of these things. For one, if the market is the place where we're receiving most of these price signals, right, and it's a small subset of this diagram, right, how is it that we would even represent some of these other aspects of environmental processes via the mechanism of price, right? So like the common monetary valuation that was assumed in this diagram, right? Here is a very problematic assumption to believe that we can translate everything into a monetary value. In part because some of these processes, right, they are outside of the operations of the price signals. Like some things are drawn into use via a price signal, but we would have to find a way to price all of the goods that are being used. So for example, like notice here, commons, that's a separate segment from the market. Why is it that these are separated? So like why is if the price signal is operating here, why doesn't the price signal automatically operate here? What makes the commons different from what's active in the market?
Well, the commons can't really be bought or sold, so there's no price.
Yeah, right. So what happens then with something like, say, if water and air were a couple examples of the commons that you were discussing, what happens if I release pollutants into the water?
Water becomes scarce, so then it like it becomes scarce, so then it would have more value monetarily and environmentally.
But who owns it? Who owns the Mississippi River? So like, you know, the dead zones example, right? Like a bunch of pesticide runoff from a lot of farms in the American Midwest runs it in the Mississippi River. The farmers aren't dumping the pest. You know, it's not like some farmer is sitting there like next to the river, like dumping the pesticide in the river, right? It is an outcome of the economic activity that the farmer is using to produce value. But who owns the river? Michael said public good, right? So if these are common pool resources and there aren't private property rights that are operating for these resources, right? Then market signals will be they will not be present for incorporating this set of costs, right? There are costs that are being imposed because if it's, as you pointed out, right, if we pollute the water so thoroughly that there's much less usable water, then in theory, the value of fresh water or like potable water ought to go up, right? But there's no property right that's assigned to those that makes that value go up. There are only costs that are being dumped onto something that is owned by the public potentially, right? Or at least is held in common. Public ownership, that's a different, you know, it's like it could be owned by the public, could not. What generic did we produce that attempts to merge market and commons as the solution to this problem? Yeah, Devin is right. The privatization CP, right, is basically, well, let's give all the elements of the commons, we will assign private property rights to begin to treat them as amenable to market signals, right? We'll treat them like any other good and assign private property rights so that the person who owns that right, in theory, has an incentive to, kind of dispose of the thing that they now own in a way that is economically beneficial, that's efficient, that creates value, that creates wealth, etc. Okay. How do we know, in assigning private property values or assigning private property rights, how do we know what that value, where should the value start? Like, what's the baseline for a bunch of these goods? Like, how much total should the Mississippi River cost? Like, what set of, how much should people pay for the property right to own the Mississippi River? I don't mean the whole thing, just like a piece of the use of the water. How do we know how to do that?
Maybe just supply and demand.
Some of the issue here, like what we've been alluding to, is the notion of an externality, right? That thing where we are imposing only costs on the commons, right? But there's no one who has to pay those costs, right? They're distributed without having any private property right that is assigned to them. That's an externality, that it is only cost that is distributed on the public and can't be internalized in a number of these signals. The purpose of something like the Clean Water Act, right, or the Clean Air Act, is in part to have the public's interest as represented by the state in regulating the use of these common pool resources, so that those costs are no longer completely externalized. They're instead being internalized into our economic activity. Okay. One of the ways to think about this is we could assign monetary values to the services that are provided by a number of these living matter, materials, and processes. So, like, for instance, okay, wetlands help purify water. Like, when water enters a wetland, a bunch of the plants and animals that live in that wetland, they like extract a bunch of toxins out of the water. They help purify the water. We could design or kind of try to figure out what that is worth. So, like, how much, if we had to, for instance, like, desalinate ocean water. I'm not suggesting that the wetlands turn salt water into fresh water, but right, example of a technological input. If we tried to say, like, okay, what if we had to do this ourselves, or we had to find some other process for doing it? How much would that cost, right? We could try to do that by analogy. Like, this amount of cost is required to produce this set of environmental outcomes. That approach is known as the ecosystems services approach. Okay, ecosystem services. That is, you try and model the service that is being provided by the ecosystem, by whatever kind of portion of the environment it is that you're trying to model. What is the amount that we would have to spend to produce a similar set of outcomes? That's what it means to have an ecosystem service. Okay, many of the environmental economists, part of the techniques that they're applying in environmental economics is to try and assign monetary values to those ecosystem services. Okay. Another way that we might try and give this kind of market signal to a set of resources is to find out what people would be willing to pay for them. Okay. So, for example, it's like you use a set of survey instruments that say, how much is it worth to you? So, like, for instance, if I'm going on a hike on a portion of the Appalachian Trail up here in Vermont, someone could give me a survey instrument that says, how much is it worth to you that on this hike, you encounter the, like, lush vegetation and wild, it's like you want to see, moose, you want to like encounter the wildlife in New England. How much is that worth to you? And I could assign a monetary value to that. That's what's known as willingness to pay. What am I willing to pay for that? Okay. For anybody who's spent any time in lab talking about the cost benefit analysis affirmative that we are writing in the AT lab, okay, cost benefit analysis uses a set of these willingness to pay survey style instruments to establish how much it is that we ought to value the set of environmental goods that would be impacted by a particular activity. Okay, so for instance, in designing a regulation for the cooling systems of power plants, which is the case study that's used in that cost benefit analysis affirmative, right? It is the EPA could conduct a series of surveys that say, well, this set of fish, you know, people are going to eat fish, like these are commercially usable fish. This is about how much people would pay for having this, you know, the availability of these fish. This is how much we would pay for, you know, certain other aspects of the ecological services that are provided by discharge, like having clean water, potable water, et cetera, in a bunch of these rivers. And one thing that you might notice in thinking about that process is there are huge value assumptions that you're bringing to the table in assigning what is or isn't valuable. Okay. Like, for example, in a number of cost benefit studies, non-use values are not considered. So, like in that power plants example, the EPA decided to assign a monetary value to species of fish that we eat, but assign zero monetary value to species of fish that humans don't consume, right? There's a very deep assumption there about what it is. If that's, you see how that's back to this, right? It also makes sense with this model that what we are talking about are use values for humans, right, as part of our economic activity. Here we are thinking much more in terms of an economy that is embedded in the biosphere. That is, we need to think about ecological processes, not simply processes that we already understand or are willing to pay for or are willing to use, right? So one kind of core premise about this substitutability debate is that there are many elements of our ecology that are too difficult to understand to properly know whether or not we can affect those processes without causing much larger damage. Okay. So one of the other things that's found in this kind of substitutability debate is like, we don't know how difficult it would be to replicate or to substitute for a given form of natural capital. Okay. And this is where you get to a graph like this from an ecological economist about how and whether to apply our existing forms of valuation to natural capital. So think for a moment about over here, this labeled the diamond water paradox, okay? Diamonds have a very high marginal value. That is, they're extremely scarce, right? So part of the reason for the value that we associate with diamonds is that at the margin, getting the next diamond, right? It's like because of the scarcity of diamonds, that's extremely difficult. If demand remains the same, okay, they are extremely valuable. Water has very low marginal value. In many locations, water has very low marginal value. Might not be true in the middle of the Sahara, right? Or like right now in Arizona. But up here in Vermont, right, water has very low marginal value. There are few times of water scarcity. There is, you know, even given a highly agricultural economy, like water is generally not scarce, so it has very low marginal value. But at the same time, if we had only diamonds, right, and no water, we would have a situation where the the water has an incredibly high absolute value. That is, it is necessary for human survival. So its value to us, its absolute value is extremely high. If we have no water, that is very damaging. If we have an abundance of water, though, it is very difficult at the margin to, you know, assign like where is it that transition occurs between like it's abundant and therefore has very low marginal value, right? Versus it is a critical natural resource that has an extremely high absolute value, so that as we begin to use it and to place demands on a number of these different ecological services, you know, whether or not we are placing a demand on them that is so critical that we will run into a situation where survival, either, you know, larger survival, right, or kind of the ability of a local environment to maintain a human population is threatened. Okay. This is the diagram here is of critical natural capital. That is, are there forms of natural capital that cannot be substituted, where because they cannot be substituted, if as the demand curve approaches some of these thresholds, right, that there are thresholds in terms of use, and then there's also an ecological threshold. That is, can you reach a tipping point past which the ability of that stock of natural capital to replenish itself disappears? So for example, like the Amazon rainforest, okay? The Amazon rainforest generates a lot of its own water. That is, like, it's literally raining out the water that is, you know, like the respiration from the forest produces the set of clouds that rain the water back down into the Amazon to some degree. And there is a concern that we don't understand. There is a threshold at some point where if you cut down enough of the forest, there is no longer enough respiration to support the cycle that maintains the rainforest. We don't know where that threshold is. We can try and find it. We can try and conduct, you know, very complicated studies by environmental scientists to figure out whether or when we are crossing those thresholds. But determining the exact threshold for a number of these potentially critical natural resources is extremely difficult, right? And for one, it's even more difficult potentially to translate that back into the terms that our economy and our policymakers understand, right? Like, if you think about, are people more literate in, like, think about the degree of literacy that we have when you, if you know, if you read, like, if you read a major paper or you're watching cable news, right? Most of the terms that are found on this diagram, like I suspect when you were reading this diagram, right? It's not something that's that unfamiliar. Yeah. Like, everybody has encountered a lot of this terminology before. How many of you encounter the terminology of critical natural capital when, you know, reading, if you're reading the news or you're going through the airport on your way to a tournament back in the days of in-person debate, you're watching, you know, the cable news input at the airport terminal, you're likely to run across the notion of critical natural capital and ecological thresholds? Not so much, right? So the core disagreement here about substitutability, the ability to monetarily represent a number of these costs that we impose on ecological resources, if what we are doing when we conduct economic activity is this instead of this, we should be making most of our economic decisions very differently, right? Because the core assumptions that we have about what economic activity is change very dramatically. In one circumstance, what we are really doing is basically using energy, and energy could potentially be the common unit. In another circumstance, monetary value, that is our own preferences or our demands for consumer satisfaction, that's because it can all be translated into monetary values. What we are saying is the preferences of individual human beings via price signaling mechanisms can accurately represent most of what we need to understand about how and whether or not we can use things efficiently or efficiently enough to maintain growth. So that's where this core disagreement plays a role in thinking a little bit about how would we model what we ought to do when making these economic decisions. I mentioned that Rayworth book is called Donut Economics. Here is her diagram of the way that we should think about economic activity. That is, there is in the inside ring of the donut, okay, is the social foundation for growth. Growth isn't the right word. It is the social foundation for an economy. That is, this economy might be one that isn't designed around growth, but it is those things that are required to sustain a human society. We need housing, we need interpersonal networks, we need energy, water, food, we want to be healthy, we need education, we need to provide work and to have some degree of income. We require peace, justice, political voice, social equity, gender equality. These are the values that are seen as providing the kind of floor for economic activity. If no one is being educated, the sustainability of that society is low. If we are at war, the sustainability of that society socially is very low. Here you have the ecological ceiling, that is the boundary beyond which some of those critical thresholds or tipping points for natural capital might be reached, right? So like the boundary condition, when we discuss that notion of planetary boundaries, right? Back here in this diagram, okay? That is that absolute decoupling doesn't just need to be absolute, it needs to be sufficient so that we do not overshoot some of these critical thresholds, okay? The critical thresholds are this notion of planetary boundaries, that is climate, ozone, access to clean air, biodiversity, whether or not the kind of have we converted so much land away from forests, for example, that we reach a critical tipping point on a number of different land conservation issues, fresh water, nitrogen and phosphorus, the overall load that is found for nitrogen and phosphorus in our uses, and then chemical pollution and ocean acidification, right? This donut of in here, this is the safe space for humanity, and just in the sense of it is socially sustainable, right? So like in theory, you could have a society that doesn't overshoot any of these boundaries, but does have a number of shortfalls here, right? That like if people do not have a political voice, or there are many, many people without housing, that even though that society might not, tip us over the threshold on climate change, that it has a number of different shortfalls with regards to what we want out of living in a society. Okay. And so, like, these kind of different core assumptions are built into when we talk about whether or not we should understand the world as a resource, how we should represent what it means for the world to be a resource. Like, I think most of us are thinking about the case of the resource perspective as, is something treated as a resource, yes or no? Like, is it something that we treat as usable? Okay. And I think instead, for some of these, environmentally or ecologically oriented perspectives, what we're talking about is not whether or not something is a resource, it's what does it mean for something to be a resource. So for example, if you look at, I want to change here for a second just to look at a card that translates a few of these terms.
Yeah.
Right. Liberal economics and the version of subjectivity, what can be termed Homo Economicus, okay, corresponds to this logic. Within modernity, okay, becomes the major form of knowledge. That is, we are governed by liberal economic political assumptions through which the new liberal order would know and appraise and order human and non-human life. The market comes to be interpreted as a naturally existing phenomenon which obeyed and had to obey natural, that is, spontaneous mechanisms of exchange. This depoliticizes the market, its relations, and associated identities and subjectivities. This removes it from any critique that could potentially lead to its replacement or restructuring. The power of neoclassical or capitalist economic thinking comes in large part because it has crowded out alternatives, rendered itself as objective or naturalized truth about the economy. Economic growth is neoliberalism's one true social policy. Growth is a functional imperative. The entire edifice of the neoliberal project, its associated identity constituting practices, from consumerism to competitive individualism, it's mobilizing the particular desires and suppression of others, its vision of market society. What order requires is a proactive and self-motivated society of willing and willful consumers oriented around and by the norms and normalization of market, competitive calculation, and specifically entrepreneurial behavior. in disembedding the market from non-market political, cultural, religious norms and the ultimate creation and recreation of a distinct new society. That is why control of the economic system by the market is of overwhelming consequence to the whole organization of society. Instead of economic relations being embedded in social relations are embedded in the market, right? So when you read a card like this, one of the things that you want to consider is it's making the claim that when something is depoliticized or denaturalized or assumed to naturally work this way, the concrete examples of what this card discusses are the way in which we think about economic activity and organize economic activity, right? That this one tiny portion of an embedded economy is treated as the entirety of how we understand what an economy does and how it operates. So that what instead, should serve as one possible portion of how we should organize some resource usage is instead represented as this is in large part the entirety of economic activity and the entirety of what an economy is and where it's located, right? So this notion of an embedded economy, right, or the donut, right, very, very different in terms of the set of concerns, terminologies, right, and that the language of, oh, I'm sorry, I think I'm only sharing the I forgot I'm only sharing the card, not the diagram now. Oh well. Hopefully you were familiar enough with the terms that we were using there, right? That this notion of identities and subjectivities, that is, that our policymaking institutions are designed to both respond to and produce people who treat themselves largely as individual consumers, right? That the economy is defined by satisfying individual needs, and that individual preferences provide us information via price signals about what people want, and that's the way that we organize economic activity. In a number of these other versions, what we would need to do is replace some of the core assumptions that we find in our economic thinking. And this would also change not just the way that we organize the economy, but also the type of people that we would train, the type of knowledge that you would learn about what it is to participate in our society, right? Like chances are that you're like, give me a thumbs up if your high school offers like an AP econ class. Okay. Or like yeah, like, okay. How many high schools offer classes in ecological economics? Yeah, right. This is kind of what a bunch of this argument gets at in terms of how it is that we train ourselves to think when we make a number of these kind of core assumptions about what we're doing and why, right? I want to reflect back on the way in which it's like some of these cards can feel very abstract in terms of like, what does it mean to produce a particular type of subject? Just understand that we're, partaking in all of those processes all of the time. And part of the argument that you find in a lot of these critical cards is what are some ways to interrupt or to change a number of those processes that kind of govern who we are, how we understand our own behavior, and where we're located. So hopefully helpful in thinking about a lot of that stuff. I need to wrap up. I'm sorry that I didn't really have time for good Q&A. Feel free to Slack me some I'm in all of the lab Slacks, so you can easily Slack me some individual questions if you're curious about following up on some of this stuff, how some of it might be usable, or some other kind of additional site suggestions as well if you're interested. Cool. Thanks a lot, y'all. Head to your next elective, and I will also admit all of the people for my next elective.